The doors were made of brass, and they were heavy. You remember that, don't you? You'd lean your whole weight into them, and they'd swing open into another world. Cool air, perfume drifting from the counters up front, and somewhere above your head, the soft hum of a building that felt bigger than the whole town outside. That was downtown. That was Saturday. Somewhere in this list, there's a young woman in white gloves standing inside a brass elevator cage, calling out floors in a voice you can still hear if you close your eyes. Somewhere in this list, there's a lunch counter where a grilled cheese cost less than $1, and the woman behind it knew your order before you sat down. And at number 1, the thing that stopped grown men on the sidewalk in December just to stare. These were not just stores. They were where a town gathered, where a father bought his first suit, where a mother chose fabric to sew a daughter's dress, where children pressed their faces to glass and believed, for just a moment, in magic. And then, one by one, the lights went out. A highway pulled the town away from downtown. A shopping center out past the edge of the fields promised the same things. Closer, with free parking. Nobody meant for it to happen this way. But it did. Quietly, store by store, city by city, until the grand old buildings on Main Street stood empty, or became something else entirely. If you remember even one of these names, you're not alone. Hit subscribe, because we're about to walk through all 25, and by the end, you'll understand why losing them meant losing something bigger than a place to shop. Let's start at number 25. 25. Sears, Roebuck and Company. You could walk in for a wrench and walk out having ordered a house. That wasn't an exaggeration. For years, Sears sold entire home kits through the mail, lumber and nails and blueprints all included, and families across the country raised the walls themselves with their neighbors' help. The downtown Sears had that particular smell, rubber tires in the automotive section mixing with fresh popcorn near the front doors. Old-timers remember the hardware aisles stretching back further than seemed possible, tools hanging in neat rows like something out of a workshop dream. You went to Sears for the things that mattered and lasted. The Craftsman wrench your father still has, the work boots that outlived 2 pairs of jeans. It felt less like shopping and more like outfitting your whole life. By some accounts, as the malls pulled shoppers to the edges of town and the mail-order catalog gave way to something faster, Sears began closing the very doors that had once meant Saturday morning to millions of families. The name still exists here and there, the feeling mostly doesn't. Someone had built that store to last a lifetime. For a while, it did. 24. Montgomery Ward. Before there was competition, there was just monkey wards. That's what folks called it. Half teasing, all affection. It was the first of its kind by many accounts. A mail-order company that grew into a downtown fixture with wide aisles and a catalog counter where a clerk would help you place an order for anything you couldn't find on the shelf. There was a particular ritual to it. You'd flip through the massive catalog at the counter, and the clerk would write your order by hand, and a few days later, it simply appeared. For rural families especially, that catalog was a lifeline to a wider world. Inside the store itself, the toy section at Christmas turned into a kind of pilgrimage. Children pressed against the glass cases, parents did quiet math in their heads, and the whole floor buzzed with a hum you don't hear anymore. The soft villain here wore a familiar face. Changing shopping habits, a shrinking downtown, and a company that couldn't quite catch up to where America was heading. The doors closed for good by the 1990s, and something that had connected small towns to the rest of the country closed with them. We didn't just lose a store, we lost a piece of mail that used to feel like a promise. 23. Woolworths. The 5 and dime. That's what everyone called it, because that's roughly what things cost. A nickel, a dime, small enough that a child with pocket change could walk out with something that felt like treasure. But it was the lunch counter that people remember most. Red stools, chrome trim, the hiss of the griddle, a grilled cheese sandwich pressed flat and golden while you spun slowly on your seat waiting. The counter wasn't just food. By some accounts, it was where entire communities gathered, where news got shared, where a Coca-Cola cost pennies, and conversation cost nothing at all. Woolworths put a version of itself on nearly every main street in America, which made it feel less like a chain and more like a hometown fixture, no matter what town you were in. As shopping shifted toward larger stores with lower prices and suburban centers pulled foot traffic away from downtown sidewalks, the five and dime model simply couldn't keep up. The last stores closed their doors in the 1990s, and with them went a certain kind of small, everyday magic. A nickel doesn't buy much anymore. It used to buy an afternoon. 22. JCPenney, downtown. Before it moved to the mall, Penny's had a downtown address, and that mattered. Walking distance from the courthouse, the diner, the bank, it sat in the middle of a town's daily life, not on its edge. Inside, there was a kind of quiet order to it. Women's dresses arranged by season, men's suits in the back with a tailor who actually knew your measurements, and clerks who called regular customers by name because, well, they were regulars. For many families, Penny's was where you bought the good clothes, the Easter dress, the first suit for a funeral or a wedding, the school shoes that had to last the whole year. It wasn't fancy, it was dependable, and for a lot of people, dependable felt like enough. As downtown emptied out and the company followed its customers to shopping centers built along new highways, the storefront that had anchored so many main streets went dark, or became something else. A bank branch, an office, sometimes nothing at all. The store moved a few miles away. The feeling of it never quite made the trip. 21. Kmart, before the blue light faded. Long before the phrase Kmart meant clearance racks and empty parking lots, it meant something else entirely. A bright, bustling destination where families spent whole Saturday afternoons. There was a particular thrill to the blue light special. A flashing blue light would spin above a table, an announcement would crackle over the speakers, and shoppers would practically run toward whatever deal had just been unveiled. It turned ordinary errands into something close to a game. Families came for school clothes, for garden supplies, for the toy aisle that seemed to stretch forever. The snack bar up front served hot dogs and slushies to kids who'd earned a treat for good behavior in the aisles. As the retail landscape shifted and larger, cheaper competitors moved in, Kmart struggled to keep pace, and the stores that once buzzed with Saturday energy grew quieter, then emptier, then closed altogether. The blue light doesn't spin anymore, but if you were there, you can still hear that crackle over the speakers. 20. W.T. Grant's. Grant's wasn't the biggest name on this list, but it might have had the biggest fall. By some accounts, in 1976, the company collapsed almost overnight, closing around 1,000 stores and leaving main streets across the country with a sudden, strange emptiness where a familiar storefront used to be. Before that, Grant's had its own particular charm. A five and dime feel with a slightly more grown-up selection, known for fair prices and clerks who treated a small purchase with the same care as a large one. Shoppers remember it as unpretentious. It didn't try to be Sears. It just tried to be reliable, and for a long time, it was. The soft villain here was overexpansion and mismanagement as much as changing habits. The company grew faster than it could support, and when the cracks showed, they spread fast. One year it was there. The next, it simply wasn't. Some losses happened slowly. This one didn't. 19. H.C. Prange. In smaller Midwestern towns, Prange's wasn't just a department store. By some accounts, it was often the anchor of the entire downtown block, the kind of place where you ran into 3 neighbors before you even reached the escalator. The store had a homegrown feel that the bigger national chains never quite managed. Window displays decorated by local staff, a bridal registry where the clerk likely knew your mother, seasonal sales that whole towns planned their weekends around. For rural families, a trip to Prange's meant a trip to town, a whole day built around one visit, lunch included, maybe a stop at the counter for coffee before the drive home. As shopping centers spread and larger chains consolidated the regional players, stores like Prange's found it harder to compete on price, and one by one, the smaller markets lost their anchor. The escalator still hummed right up until the day it didn't. 18. McClellan's played the same game as Woolworth's. Nickel and dime pricing, a lunch counter, a Main Street storefront, but in smaller cities, it was often McClellan's that got there first. The store had a particular rhythm to it. Bins of ribbon and thread near the front, a candy counter that filled the air with a sweetness you could smell from the sidewalk, and toward the back, a soda fountain where a milkshake and a stool were the reward for a long day of errands. It was the kind of place a child could walk into with $1 and walk out feeling rich. As the 5 and dime model faded across the country, squeezed by larger discount stores and changing shopping habits, McClellan's closed its doors along with most of its 5 and dime cousins, another quiet exit from a Main Street that was slowly going dark. $1 doesn't go as far these days. Back then, it went far enough. Here's something worth pausing on. In the 1960s, these stores weren't just places to shop. They were the beating heart of the entire town. By some accounts, the big department store on Main Street was often the largest employer for miles. Your neighbor worked the register. Your cousin ran the stockroom. Your church friend wrapped gifts every December. These weren't distant corporations. They were woven into the fabric of daily life. These stores sponsored the Christmas parade. They lit the town's biggest tree. Their windows were where children pressed their faces every December, and their sidewalks were where teenagers met before the movies. Going downtown wasn't a chore. It was an event. You dressed for it, you planned your day around it, and you likely ran into half the town before you made it home. That world had a rhythm all its own, and it was about to change faster than anyone expected. 17. Gimbals. Does Macy's tell Gimbals? That old saying came from a very real rivalry, one that played out for decades on the streets of New York and in a handful of other major cities where Gimbals planted its flag. Gimbals had its own particular energy, a little brasher than its famous rival, a little more willing to compete hard on price and spectacle. The Thanksgiving Day parade tradition, in fact, had roots tangled up with this very rivalry between the two department store giants. Inside, shoppers remember grand staircases, elaborate window displays, and a scale that made even a simple errand feel like an occasion. Gimbals wasn't subtle. It wasn't trying to be. By the 1980s, changing retail habits and mounting financial pressure caught up with the chain, and in 1987, the doors closed for good. A sudden, quiet end for a name that had once been shouted in the same breath as its biggest competitor. The rivalry outlived the store. The store didn't get to see how the story ended. 16. Bamberger's. In New Jersey, Bamberger's was simply Bams to the people who shopped there. A name said with the kind of familiarity you reserve for a place that feels like your own. The Newark flagship store was, by some accounts, one of the largest department stores in the country in its day. A sprawling building with departments for everything a family could need, staffed by clerks who'd often worked there for decades. There was a particular pride to shopping at Bamberger's, a sense that this was where the community's biggest occasions were outfitted, from wedding registries to graduation suits. Eventually, the parent company folded the beloved local name into its own national brand, and the Bamberger's sign came down for good, replaced by something more familiar to shoppers everywhere else, and less familiar to the people who'd called it Bams their whole lives. The building still stands in some form. The name it wore for generations doesn't. 15. Hecht's. Across the Mid-Atlantic, Hecht's was the kind of store that showed up in family photographs without anyone meaning it to. The backdrop to prom dress shopping, wedding registries, and the Christmas windows that kids begged to drive past every December. The flagship stores were architectural landmarks in their own right, with grand entrances and elaborate seasonal displays that turned window shopping into a genuine event, no purchase required. For generations of families across Virginia, Maryland, and the surrounding region, Hecht's was simply where you went. Not because there wasn't another option, but because it felt like the right one. As larger national chains consolidated the department store landscape in the early 2000s, the Hex name was eventually folded into a bigger corporate umbrella, and a piece of regional identity quietly disappeared along with it. Some names don't just close, they get absorbed, one letter at a time, until they're gone. 14. Hudson's. In Detroit there was Hudson's, and there was by some accounts nothing else quite like it. The flagship store downtown was one of the tallest and largest department stores ever built in America, 20-some floors of everything a growing city could want. The building had its own train station in the basement, connecting directly to Detroit's transit system, so shoppers could step off a streetcar and straight into the perfume counter. The Thanksgiving parade tradition here, too, had deep roots tied to the store itself. For generations, "Meet me at Hudson's" was simply what you said when you wanted to see someone downtown. It wasn't a landmark, it was a meeting point built into the language of the city. As downtown Detroit changed and retail shifted toward the suburbs, the flagship tower eventually closed, standing empty for years before it was finally taken down. A physical absence where a city's beating heart used to be. They could level the building, they couldn't level what people remembered inside it. 13. Filene's. In Boston, Filene's was a landmark in its own right, but it was the basement that made it famous nationwide. A legendary bargain floor where prices dropped automatically the longer an item sat unsold, and shoppers would dig through racks with the focus of treasure hunters. By some accounts, women would line up before opening, and the moment those doors unlocked, the rush inside was somewhere between a shopping trip and a sporting event. Elbows were involved. So was strategy. Above the basement, the main store carried itself with more polish. Fine wool coats, tailored suits, a sense of occasion to every purchase. It was the kind of place where you dressed up a little just to shop. As downtown Boston's retail landscape shifted and larger chains absorbed regional names, the flagship eventually closed, and the famous basement, once one of the most talked-about shopping destinations in the country, went quiet for good. Nobody haggles like that anymore. Maybe that's exactly what got lost. 12. Goldwater's. Across Arizona, Goldwater's dressed the Southwest. Literally. The family behind the store understood the region's particular blend of ranch practicality and desert elegance, and their windows reflected it, season after season. The flagship store in downtown Phoenix carried a scale and ambition that surprised visitors who didn't expect to find that kind of retail grandeur in the desert. Marble floors, wide aisles, a genuine sense of occasion built into every visit. For generations of Arizona families, Goldwater's was where you bought the good boots, the wedding suit, the dress for the school dance. It felt like it belonged to the region in a way the bigger national names never quite managed. As national retail chains expanded into the Southwest and shopping shifted toward newer centers, the Goldwater's name eventually disappeared into a larger corporate banner, and a distinctly regional identity faded along with it. The desert remembers its own. For a while, so did the store that dressed it. 11. Maison Blanche. In New Orleans, walking into Maison Blanche meant walking into a particular kind of atmosphere, perfume in the air near the entrance, and if you were lucky enough to visit around the holidays, the scent of roasting chicory coffee drifting up from below. The store's rooftop Santa, by some accounts, became a beloved local tradition, broadcast for years and eagerly awaited by generations of New Orleans children who measured Christmas by his arrival. Inside, the store carried itself with a distinctly Southern elegance. Gloved elevator attendants, a tea room for ladies who lunched, a sense that shopping here was as much about the experience as the purchase. As national chains consolidated the department store landscape, the Maison Blanche name was eventually retired, folded into a larger company, and a piece of New Orleans' own retail identity quietly stepped aside. The chicory coffee smell is easy to find again. The rest of it isn't. 10. Yonkers. In Iowa, Yonkers held on longer than most. a regional department store with roots reaching back well over a century, anchoring downtown blocks and later suburban malls across the Midwest. The flagship store in Des Moines carried a particular civic pride. Locals spoke of it the way you'd speak of a courthouse or a church, a fixture so permanent it seemed like it would simply always be there. Generations of Iowa families outfitted themselves at Yonkers. Easter dresses, wedding parties, back-to-school shoes, trusting the store the way you trust a longtime neighbor. As national ownership changes and shifting retail habits caught up with even the most enduring regional names, Yonkers finally closed its remaining stores, ending a run that had spanned well over 100 years. 150 years is a long time to be somebody's neighbor. It still wasn't long enough. Here's the part of the story that changed everything. Through the 1960s and 70s, new interstate highways reshaped where Americans lived and where they shopped. Families who once walked or took the streetcar downtown now had cars, and those cars could just as easily drive the other direction, out past the edge of town. Developers noticed. By some accounts, enclosed shopping malls began rising in those very spaces, climate-controlled, surrounded by free parking, built around exactly the kind of anchor department stores that had once defined Main Street. It wasn't a single dramatic event. It was slower than that, and in some ways sadder. A few shoppers at a time choosing the mall over downtown, a few stores at a time following their customers out to the suburbs, until the sidewalks that used to fill up every Saturday started staying quiet. Nobody closed downtown on purpose. It just got left behind, one convenient parking spot at a time. 9. Free parking downtown. It sounds small now, almost silly to even mention, but there was a time when parking downtown for a shopping trip didn't cost you anything at all. No meters ticking down, no garage fee waiting at the exit. Many of these grand department stores validated your parking ticket right at the register, a small stamp that meant your whole afternoon downtown cost nothing extra beyond what you'd already spent inside. It made a trip downtown feel generous, almost like the store was thanking you just for showing up. Families would plan entire Saturdays around it. Shopping, lunch at the counter, maybe a movie, all without watching a parking clock. As downtowns aged and cities began charging for the same curbside spots that used to be free, that small kindness quietly disappeared. Right around the same time, the shopping malls out on the highway were advertising acres of parking that never cost a dime. It's a small thing to miss. Somehow, it's one of the things people mention first. 8. The Fabric and Notions Counter. Before store-bought meant the only option, there was the fabric counter. Bolts of cotton and wool stacked floor to ceiling, a smell of new cloth and cardboard, and a clerk who could measure a yard by eye almost as accurately as the tape. Mothers came here with a pattern tucked under one arm, running their fingers across bolts of fabric, feeling for the right weight and drape before committing to a purchase that would become a school dress, a Sunday shirt, a set of curtains for the front room. There was real pride in it. A garment you'd sewn yourself carried a kind of care that store-bought clothes didn't quite match, and everyone in the family knew whose hands had made it. As ready-made clothing became cheaper and more widely available, and as fewer families made time for sewing at home, these counters shrank and eventually disappeared from department store floor plans altogether. Somebody's grandmother knew exactly how much fabric a growing girl would need for next year too. We stopped needing to know that. 7. The Christmas Toy Department. Nothing tested a child's patience quite like the toy department in December. An entire floor transformed, aisles packed end to end with dolls and trains and bicycles, and at the far end, always, the line. The line led to Santa's chair, and by some accounts, department stores across the country competed fiercely over whose Santa looked the most convincing, whose set looked the most magical, whose photo package parents would want to buy and keep forever. Waiting in that line was its own kind of ritual. Children rehearsing their requests under their breath, parents shushing arguments about who got the biggest present, the whole floor humming with barely contained excitement. As shopping habits shifted toward malls, then big box stores, then screens, that particular kind of shared, in-person holiday magic became harder to find, and eventually many stores stopped building that elaborate Christmas world at all. You don't remember what you asked Santa for that year. You remember exactly what the line felt like. 6. Professional gift wrapping. There was an art to it, and these stores treated it like one. You'd hand your purchase across the counter, and a clerk would fold paper into crisp hospital corners, tie a ribbon with a flourish, and curl it with the edge of a scissor blade until it sprang into perfect loops. It cost little or nothing extra. By some accounts, it was simply part of the service, a small flourish included with your purchase, no different than a bag or a receipt. The gift that came out the other side looked like something from a magazine, and there was a particular satisfaction in handing over a beautifully wrapped box, knowing someone else's careful hands had made it look that good. As stores cut costs and self-service became the norm everywhere, that small, skilled service quietly vanished from department store counters, replaced by a roll of paper you were expected to wrap yourself. Someone had decided you were worth doing right, even for something as small as a bow. 5. The Sears Christmas Wish Book. Every fall, it arrived, thick as a phone book, printed on paper that had its own particular smell, and by some accounts, it was the single most anticipated piece of mail a child could receive. Kids didn't just look through the wish book. They studied it, dog-earing pages, circling toys in pencil, negotiating with siblings over who got to hold it first. The toy section in the back was sacred territory, poured over so many times the pages softened at the corners. Parents used it too, in their own quiet way, flipping through in the evening after the kids were asleep, doing the math on what Christmas could afford that year, making decisions that never got spoken about out loud. As the internet made browsing instant and catalogs became an expensive relic of a slower kind of shopping, Sears eventually stopped printing the wish book altogether, ending a tradition that had shaped generations of Christmas mornings. You didn't just wish on stars back then. You wished on page 47, corner turned down, circled twice. 4. The smell of the perfume counter. You knew you'd arrived the moment you walked through the doors. A wave of perfume, warm and layered, drifting from the glass counters positioned deliberately at the entrance, the first impression the store wanted you to have. Behind the counter, saleswomen in crisp uniforms offered a spritz on your wrist if you slowed down even a little, and by some accounts, choosing a bottle for a birthday or an anniversary was treated as its own small occasion, worthy of real attention and care. That smell became tangled up with the memory of the whole building. Perfume near the front, leather and accessories, popcorn drifting from somewhere near the exit. Your nose remembered the store as much as your eyes did. As department stores closed and perfume shopping moved to specialty retailers and, eventually, online, that specific sensory welcome, the first thing you noticed before you'd even seen a single aisle, quietly disappeared. Close your eyes right now. You can probably still smell it. 3. The elevator operator. Before elevators ran themselves, a young woman in a crisp uniform stood inside the brass cage, one gloved hand on the lever, calling out each floor as the doors slid open. Second floor, ladies' wear, notions, and fine china. It was a real job, and by some accounts, a respected one. Elevator operators were trained not just to run the car, but to represent the store itself, greeting regulars by name and keeping first-time visitors from feeling lost in a building that could span half a city block. Riding that elevator felt like an event in itself, especially for children. The soft lurch as it started, the operator's voice echoing off brass and marble, the small thrill of being trusted to stand still and behave. As automatic elevators became standard and department stores looked to cut costs wherever they could, that particular job, and the small daily courtesy that came with it, disappeared from stores across the country. Nobody announces the floors anymore. You just have to already know where you're going. 2. The lunch counter. Right in the middle of the store, between housewares and hosiery, sat a row of chrome stools bolted to the floor, worn smooth by decades of Saturday shoppers taking a break from the aisles. The menu never needed much explaining. A grilled cheese pressed flat on the griddle, a cherry Coke poured over ice, a slice of pie under a glass dome that had been sitting there since morning, looking better with every hour. The woman working the counter likely knew half the regulars by name and their order before they said a word. Sitting there meant something. It meant the shopping trip had a pause built into it, a moment to rest your feet, watch the store hum around you, and talk with whoever you'd brought along, uninterrupted by anything else. As stores redesigned their floor plans to fit more merchandise and fast food restaurants sprang up along the same new highways that pulled shoppers to the suburbs, the lunch counter slowly disappeared from department store floors across the country. Nobody sits at a counter like that anymore. Everybody used to. 1. The animated Christmas window. And here it is, the one that stopped people cold on the sidewalk. Every December, the department store's street-level windows transformed into something out of a dream. Mechanical figures moving in careful loops, snow drifting behind glass, tiny lit villages with windows that glowed like real houses on a real winter night. By some accounts, families would drive downtown specifically to see the windows, bundling children up against the cold just to stand on a crowded sidewalk and stare at painted scenery and moving toys behind glass. Store employees worked for weeks beforehand, building entire miniature worlds by hand, testing every mechanism until it moved just right. Standing in front of that window, as a child, you believed it completely. The reindeer really pulled the sleigh. The elves really worked in that little glowing shop. For a few minutes on a cold sidewalk, the whole world felt exactly as magical as you needed it to be. As downtown emptied out and department stores closed one after another, the budgets and the craftspeople who built those windows disappeared along with them. A few museums and historical societies have tried to keep pieces of that tradition alive, but the full spectacle, an entire storefront transformed, block after block all down Main Street, mostly exists in memory now. Someone spent weeks building a world you'd only stand in front of for 5 minutes. That's how much they wanted you to believe in it. It would be easy to say everything back then was better. It wasn't. The lines were long, the prices weren't always fair, and plenty of people were left out of the picture entirely. We don't tell this story to pretend the past was perfect. We tell it because something real disappeared, and it's worth naming honestly. These stores weren't just buildings full of merchandise. They were where a town gathered without meaning to, where you ran into your neighbor, where your children learned patience in a Santa line, where a stranger behind a counter wrapped your gift like it mattered, because to her, it did. The mall promised the same convenience, closer to home. In some ways, it delivered. But convenience was never quite the same thing as connection. And somewhere between the highway and the parking lot and the empty storefront, we traded one for the other without quite noticing until it was gone. Main Street didn't die all at once. It just got quieter, year after year, until the quiet became normal. If you were there, if you remember the smell of that perfume counter, or the sound of the elevator operator calling out floors, or the exact flavor of a grilled cheese from a lunch counter that doesn't exist anymore, tell me in the comments. Tell me which store was yours. Tell me what you'd give to walk through those doors just one more time. And if this kind of memory means something to you, you'll want to see the video I made about the women who held their families together during the hardest years this country ever faced. 25 forgotten things Depression-era women did to keep poverty from showing. It's right here, and I think you'll recognize more of it than you expect.